Will the real economy ever recover? This is part 2 in a 2-part series. In part 1, we discovered because the global economy has been built on a very volatile euro-dollar system, in order for the economy to truly recover and be structurally sound and anti-fragile, we need a completely different monetary system. And that brings us to today's video, where we'll start with step number 3 and go over the solutions. But to do this, we always have to remember that our main objective is the limitation of government spending, because this is a misallocation of scarce resources with alternative uses. And this means limiting social programs. And a lot of people on the left, the liberals, the progressives, whatever you want to call them, not that they're right or wrong, but they always get fixated on social programs being cut back. But if we have limited government, we reduce the amount of war and we increase the amount of personal privacy, something that any liberal, or anyone for that matter, should be in favor of. So let's shelf that just for a moment, because we're going to come back to it. We just need to remember that is our number 1 priority. Because remember, as Dr. Thomas Sowell says, there are no solutions, only alternatives. So let's look at a couple potential things we could do to restructure the current monetary system. We could go to 100% backing or a 50% backing. This takes us all the way back to the gold standards. There's pros and cons of each. To dive into them deeper and really understand them, let's go right to Mises.org. The first idea we need to contend with is the ability for the money supply to expand to maximize economic growth. People who argue against a 100% backed currency, such as a 100% gold standard, argue that there is just not enough gold in the world to provide such a currency. Moreover, a pure gold standard, they argue, would be unworkably rigid. On the other hand, a fractional reserve system, they say, is flexible. It can be adjusted to the needs of business. It provides an elastic currency. And again, the benefit here is that the currency and credit can expand to facilitate maximum economic growth. Unfortunately, a fractional reserve system has drawbacks, especially when it exists, as it usually does, with a central bank, a government, and public opinion eager to keep expanding credit to start a quote-unquote full employment boom, or to keep it going. Brings about what is known as the business cycle, that periodic oscillation of boom and bust that socialists and communists attribute not to the monetary and credit system and central banking, but to some inherent tendency in the capitalist system itself. And obviously, this really resonates with what we're seeing in the world and in the United States more specifically today. So you may be saying to yourself, well, my gosh, that is so true. This must have been written in the last week, or maybe the last month, or at the most the last couple months. But when we go to the top of the article, we see that this was written by none other than Henry Hazlitt in 1979. Truly prescient words from Henry Hazlitt and the Austrians about how the boom and bust cycle can lead to socialism and communism. If you look around us in the world today, we can see this playing out right in front of our eyes. So just as a recap, we have a 100% reserve system and a fractional reserve system. We'll call it 50%. The pro over here is it produces far fewer boom and bust cycles, if any at all. The con is that it potentially limits economic growth, because you can't expand the money supply to keep pace with the needs of the private sector trying to produce more and more goods and services more efficiently. On the fractional reserve side, the con is that it has a higher propensity to create boom and bust cycles, but it does allow for additional money growth and the expansion of credit to facilitate higher economic growth. Although I would argue that usually this is only short term. As an example, I drew a chart. On the bottom, we have time expanding or time increasing. On the left, we have output increasing. The green line represents a 100% reserve system. It goes up very slowly, kind of a turtle's pace, but it just chugs along and goes up and up and up. Now, the high flyer, the rabbit in the story, the fractional reserve system, in the short term, it goes up a lot faster, but then of course we get ahead of ourselves as human beings. We have this bus cycle, but it goes down, but then it goes back up, then back down. But at the end point, we still have the same amount of economic growth. And although this makes sense, it might not be true. I would argue that the fractional reserve system over time increases the overall debt burden. Also, it allows for government to get involved and create this misallocation of resources by lowering interest rates, as an example, to artificially low levels. We all know what that's done, and let's not even talk about quantitative easing. So at the beginning, yes, the blue line and the green line do go up the same amount, just at a different pace. But over time, the blue line, because of this debt burden and because we're misallocating resources, it starts to plateau. Then what happens? The Keynesians, the central bankers, and the government come in and say, look, we've got this delta between what the economy is producing and what we should be producing. There's excess capacity in the system. So we'll just create more money, we'll create more debt, that will fix the problem. But you know, as well as I do, that exacerbates the problem. So initially it starts to plateau, but then once we get all of this central planning, artificially low interest rates, money printing, and excessive debt, it takes it lower and lower and lower. As the economy and the private sector decline, the government spending as a percentage of GDP gets higher and higher and higher. We'll take that to its logical conclusion, where the government spending accounts for 100% of GDP, and we go right back to where we started with Henry Hazlitt, that we're now at socialism or communism. So ideally, we would have a system that would allow for sufficient monetary and credit expansion to keep up with the pace of the private sector, creating more goods and services. But as Dr. Thomas Sowell says, there are no solutions, there are only alternatives. And understanding that we're imperfect creatures in an imperfect world, I'm always going to favor the 100% reserve system. That said, I'm more than open to new technologies creating a system in the future that will solve the problem of us being human beings and needing that additional expansion of money supply and credit. But let's take it to the next step. Say we've got 100% reserve backing or even a fractional reserve backing, but it's backed by something. Do we back it by gold, old school, or maybe something like Bitcoin, a cryptocurrency, and blockchain technology? Let's walk through the pros and the cons. The pro is gold has a 5,000-year history. That's for sure. We don't have to worry about people having confidence in gold or gold maintaining its purchasing power. Definitely a store of value we can all count on. I would also add that it does allow for small amounts of expansion in money supply and credit because every single year there's more gold produced. The con is that logistically it's very cumbersome and it's not efficient to have to move physical gold from the United States to Japan to South America or to Europe, to wherever around the world. In 2020, with the global economy we have, we need things moving quickly to maximize our productivity. So that takes us over to the Bitcoin cryptocurrency blockchain side. The con there is it has no history whatsoever and it's very volatile, at least no history considering the 5,000 years we have with gold. And there is no room for expansion in the monetary supply. Many of you would argue this is actually a feature, not a bug. And to a certain extent, I would agree over the long term. But we need to analyze this further. We're going to get into that in just a moment. Before we do, let's look at the main pro, and that's that logistics are seamless. It's very efficient to transfer Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency around the world instantaneously. And also in the future, Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency could be payment in and of itself instead of just used as backing another currency. But right now we don't have the technology because there's so many payments and transactions that happen on a daily basis. But there's always that possibility in the future when technology advances. But the wild card is this technological option could give us the opportunity to get completely outside of the banking system to where we didn't even need banks at all. We would have complete reliance on ourselves, not the banksters. We eliminate crony capitalism and corporatism that's always blamed on free market capitalism. And it's not just me saying this. The experts are thinking about this as well. As an example, let's go right back to my interview with Jeff Snyder and Lynn Alden. Jeff, you were saying that we can't really fix the system as is right now and have a permanent solution because it's predicated upon the banking system, and that is inherently volatile, let's say. So we'd need preferably, we'd have a system outside of the banking system. So my first question would be, what does that look like? And then if we can transition to a better system smoothly, is there a way to do that? Or are we just, the only way to transition is if the whole thing collapses and we rebuild it like the phoenix coming out of the ashes?
I hope not. I hope that's not the transition, but it's a difficult thing. And it starts with, recognizing the problem as it is and recognizing that there is a problem. And if we wait for politicians to get their heads out of their asses and say, okay, we need to do something, then maybe that's what we're left with doing. That the crisis, the next big crisis is what finally convinces them they need to do something. Where do we go from here? I think we transition to a world, hopefully, that is based in some way on digital currency, blockchain, whatever it might be. I don't necessarily believe that might be Bitcoin, but I think there's value in the Bitcoin technology. There's definitely value in blockchain technology, maybe an iteration or two down the road. There is definitely a way to do a currency system that is non-bank centered. And if you really think about it, blockchain, if you use blockchain as a payments base, to account for all the payments that flow throughout the economy, we don't even need banks anymore. We could have a bankless monetary system that would actually, I believe, function, assuming that we could set it up in the right manner. And right manner is a loaded term that opens all sorts of Pandora's boxes. But I think there's a way to do this a digital currency way so that it can be dependable, predictable, and operate in a steady fashion, a sustainably steady fashion that solves a lot of the basic issues with the Eurodollar system. I don't think it'll necessarily be perfect, but we can't let perfect be the enemy of good here.
And the more decentralized we can make our monetary system, the more this limits government, our main objective. But before all you crypto guys and gals start celebrating and saying, see, George is finally seeing the light, there is something else we need to explore that might tip the scales back in the favor of good old-fashioned gold. To think through how a Bitcoin standard or a cryptocurrency standard would work, let's go back and revisit the good old-fashioned gold standard. United States, we'll start with that on the right, and we have country XYZ. Of course, the USA is running a huge trade deficit, which means that there's more stuff being imported into the United States than is being exported. What that means, if we were on a Bitcoin standard, is the United States would have a net decrease in the amount of Bitcoin it has in circulation. Country XYZ that had the trade surplus would have an additional amount of Bitcoin circulating within their system. So this creates additional money supply. So technically we would have inflation in country XYZ, meaning consumer prices going up. In the United States, we would have consumer price deflation, but not as a result of more efficiencies and more goods and services being produced, but a lowering of the overall money supply. Back in the days when wages were flexible, there was no minimum wage, we had very little credit in the system, and the economy wasn't built on debt and asset bubbles. This deflation wasn't a big deal because money goes down, prices go down, and everything else goes down with it. So you have this equilibrium. But in today's economy, where wages are very sticky, we have excessive credit in the system, everyone's levered to the hilt, and we have an economy that's built on debt, asset bubbles, and confidence. If we had a deflationary spiral due to lower money supply, that would be completely catastrophic. So the main takeaway is that although I favor a 100% reserve system, and a system based on technology could be very interesting in the future. It may allow us to limit the size of government even further, also reduce crony capitalism and corporatism. It might not be realistic in today's day and age. Why? Because if we transfer to this system overnight, either of these systems, it would completely collapse the economy because of what we went over in this diagram. We'd have to go all the way back to the late 1800s where we had limited government, no central bank whatsoever, low regulation, and low taxes. And the probability of that is extremely low. So a hybrid system, maybe 50% reserve, or a system backed by gold that does expand slightly could be better for what we're dealing with today, the way the economy is currently set up. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you favor a 100% reserve system, a fractional reserve system? And do you favor a gold-backed system or a crypto blockchain system? I want to hear what your thoughts are. Let me know and we'll see you in the comments. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.